So returning to GDP here, one of the questions we could have is, what's an appropriate way to measure well-being? And as you may imagine, there's going to be a host of different ways. So if we were in class, we could brainstorm, and I tried to extract from you a number of different options. We could have a good discussion about that. Right now, I'm just going to propose 3 possibilities. These are not meant to be a definitive list by any stretch of the imagination. So we could think about how much food people have. How many calories do you consume? We could think about how much living space people have. We could think about how much income people have. It turns out there's an almost infinite number of different ways. We could look at leisure time. We could look at, we could look at vacations to Paris. We could look at a variety of other things. Now, all of these are going to have some issues with them. And it turns out my contention would be that any measure of well-being is going to have issues. So caloric intake, we could again, in class, we could have a nice discussion as to what some issues with caloric intake would be. And one I can think of right off my top of my head is preferences, right? Not just how many calories are you consuming, but maybe are you consuming the type of stuff you want to be consuming? Are you consuming steak if you like steak? Are you consuming Indian food if you like Indian food? What are you consuming, right? The other interesting thing is some people think about what would happen if we measured well-being entirely based on caloric intake. If somebody goes on a diet to try and improve their life, their well-being measured by caloric intake would go down. So this isn't to say we wouldn't want to take into account caloric intake, but it's to say that there would be issues with using caloric intake as the only measure. How about living space? Well, by living space, the measure of living space, somebody out in Broadus, Montana is going to be much, much better off than somebody in New York City. Now, that might be true, but we probably would understand that that's not the only thing that people care about. My guess is if you ask most people in New York City if they would want to move to Broadus, Montana to live in a larger house or space, they'd say no. Now, you might get the exact same response if you ask people in Broadus if they want to move to New York, but basically, again, this here, again, would miss preferences, but another thing we could look at is definitely going to miss population density. Holding population density constant, it's probably the case that having more living space, larger houses, larger apartments, probably is a better thing. But of course, everything else is not staying constant. Income. Think about what would happen to your well-being as measured by income when you decided to go to college. Now, my guess is most of you went to college because you want your life to be better. Now, for many of you, going to college meant a decrease in your income. And that would arguably, certainly as measured by income, everybody who goes to college is worse off. Now, is that true? Almost certainly not. That if people thought that university was making them worse off, people would stop going, or at least sensible people should stop going. The other issue would be somebody who works a full-time job straight out of high school versus somebody who goes to college. Measured by income, we're going to be missing something in addition to other areas, one of which would just be the lag that it takes between investing in human capital, which is arguably what most of you are doing here, and the time it takes for that to show up in your income. This isn't to say that these 3 things are not meaningful. It's simply the point I'm trying to make is that any single measure of well-being is almost certainly going to be inappropriate or inadequate. It's not going to be up to the task. And so I would argue for the case that we should triangulate to try and figure out well-being. We should look at more than one measure. And that would certainly be my argument for the way we should approach GDP. So what is this GDP thing? Well, gross domestic product, that's what GDP stands for, gross domestic product, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. Straightforward, right? Well, let's see if we can take that to pieces here, one piece at a time. So market value. What do we mean by market value? Now, if I had a Group of you in class, I would ask whether market value overestimates or underestimates well-being. So market value would be the price of each good times the quantity of goods sold, and we add all of those up. Now, on that margin, GDP is going to be an underestimate of well-being. We could maybe talk about that. One of the ways to look at that would be to draw a demand schedule and see whether market value over or underestimates well-being. And hopefully you'll realize that GDP, or market value rather, underestimates well-being. Think about the total benefit to consumers versus the price that they pay. The issue, of course, is that while market value is an underestimate of well-being, at least on this margin, it's at least a reliable one. If we were going to substitute something else in for market value, what would we substitute in? Maybe I would say, well, board games, if I'm calculating this, board games are really important, and Triumph motorcycles are really important, far more important than their market value. And I would probably say, well, I don't really care much about sports, and so all of this money that's going into sports and the market value of tickets, obviously that has changed in the last couple of weeks, but, right, you think about all the tickets to the NBA and say, that's a gross overestimate. So while market value is inherently an underestimate, it's at least hopefully a reliable underestimate that if somebody says, how do you know this, we can at least answer it. We can say, well, we observe people's behavior. We observe whether or not they're willing to sacrifice for this. And so while we expect the value is greater than that, and quite honestly, probably quite a lot bigger than that, at the end of the day, we're going to use this not because it's the right answer, but because it's a reliable way to answer the how do you know that question. Okay, so market value. So in other words, price times quantity. The price of every good sold times the quantity of all the goods sold. Side note, and I'll probably try and reiterate this. Conceptually, I understand how GDP works and what it measures. Practically, it makes my brain hurt to think about going out into the economy and collecting all prices and all quantities. That would indicate that there's a reason why I'm not a government statistician. So I'm going to, at least for the time being, trust that there are very smart, very skilled people who are devoting their life to effectively calculating the market value. So when you get confused or stuck, what I would encourage you to do is retreat to the conceptual definition and then move from there. Okay, so GDP is the market value of all final. So what does that mean? Well, we are only going to be counting final items. In other words, we don't want to count the steering wheel or the tires or the engine and the car. Again, if we were in class, we could have a reasoned discussion as to why this is. I would argue that the main reason for this is so that we count items once and only once. Say we counted the tires on a car and the engine when it's sold and the radio and the floor mats. And then we counted the sale of the car on the car lot. Well, then we're going to be, in fact, counting all of those items at least twice. We're going to be counting them at the point of sale, and then we will be counting them in their bundled contribution to the sale price of the car. So again, this isn't saying that all we care about is final goods and services. It's saying that practically we need to restrict our measurement to final goods and services because otherwise we will be double counting, which on that margin would mean we would be overestimating well-being. So GDP is the market value of all final. And here, right, again, this is more to illustrate that we don't just add up quantities, because then we would end up at 32 million. We would be counting cars and computers as the same. We also don't add up just the prices. We want the whole thing. Because again, what we're trying to get at is value. So the market value of all final goods and services. So goods would be stuff and services would be services, right? Now the reason this is important is that the composition of an economy differs from country to country. As one example, As the United States has become wealthier, an ever larger share of the economy is devoted to services. So if we look at this in 1950, only around 20% of the economy was devoted to services. By 2000, we had topped 40%, and even by now, who knows, we may be reaching 50%. So if we neglected services, which arguably are harder to measure, and we just looked at goods, then we would be missing, at least in the United States, around 40% of economic activity, thus underestimating well-being. Incidentally, different countries across different periods of time have a different share of activity devoted to services. Typically, as countries become wealthier, a larger share of economic activity is devoted to services. When we start talking here in a little bit about non-market production, we can return to that. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. Now, there's a couple key things here. Produced means that we are going to be underestimating well-being as measured by GDP. Why? Well, think about it. How many of you drive a car that was produced this year? I certainly don't. I don't even have a car. But my Triumph motorcycle was a 2012 model. I bought it in 2014. It was counted in 2012 or probably 2011's GDP, depending on how they work model years on motorcycles. So it was counted in 2011's GDP. It's not counted in our current GDP. It's not counted in GDP when I bought it in 2016 or 2017. And yet I still derive an immense amount of satisfaction out of it. This applies for houses, this applies for buildings, this applies for a whole bunch of stuff. GDP is a measure of production. And so on that margin, it's almost certainly going to be an underestimate of well-being. The last two pieces, within a country in a year, actually can be changed. We could talk about produced within a geographic area within a time period. The tradition tends to be yearly, and it tends to be by country. But we could talk about first quarter 2020 Montanan GDP. That would be the market value of all final goods and services produced in Montana in the first quarter of this year, January, February, and March. So there's no reason why we can't change that, but basically, so if we want a generalized definition, it would be GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a geographic area in a certain period of time. The convention, again, as I mentioned, is country and year, but those are plastic. The rest of it, however, is not. So that's what GDP is, market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. And that's an important thing to note. It's just to know what it is. Now, and again, this is what I had been showing you in those charts, which is actually not GDP, but GDP per capita. So what do you think GDP per capita is? Well, GDP per capita means per head. So in other words, per person. And so what GDP per capita is, wait for it, it's really scary. Actually, it's not. It's just GDP divided by the population. So in other words, it would be the average production in a year. So it would be the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year per person. Now that doesn't mean that every person's going to get that amount. GDP doesn't tell us anything about income inequality. Now I'm jumping ahead a little bit into some of the shortcomings. But GDP per capita, in effect, gives us some sense of how productive an economy is on a per capita or per person basis. Why might we want to look at GDP per capita? Well, let's see here. So this is 2007 GDP in 2007 dollars. So that's in constant dollars. We can talk about why that matters later. This is in US dollars per purchasing power parity adjusted. So if you look at this, look on the first column there, obviously we have the country names, and then just to the right of that we have GDP. That's just Total GDP, and that's in billions of US dollars. United States, out of the countries listed in this table, had the highest GDP in 2007, and China was not far behind, pretty much 3/4 of US levels. Not at US levels, but 3/4 of US levels. India was third, at around a third of American GDP. Japan was still around a third. Germany now coming up behind. We get down to the bottom, Italy. Now, so that's ranked by GDP. Now, something, if you think about it, is that there are a lot of people in China and India. And so one way, if you wanted to think about ways to increase GDP, you could go colonize other countries. That would be a way to increase GDP. It wouldn't necessarily in any way, shape, or form increase the well-being of any citizens in either country necessarily. So let's see what happens. So you think United States, China, and India. First, second, and third ranked in terms of GDP. The UK bringing up the rear, not quite. Italy bringing up the rear. But France, Italy, and the UK definitely not doing particularly well in terms of GDP. So let me reorder this by GDP per capita. And when we reorder this by GDP per capita rather than GDP, the United States is still at the top. The United Kingdom now is second. Then we have Germany. We have Japan. And Japan, by the way, was at what? Around a third of American GDP. Now it's at 2/3, isn't it? Roughly. So a big difference there. On the other hand, China, that was second in terms of GDP, is down there in terms of GDP per capita. In terms of GDP, it was roughly, what would that be? 2/3 of American GDP. When we get down to GDP per capita, it's a little over 10% of American GDP per capita. And India is below 10% in GDP per capita. In other words, one of the things we might want to look at is how productive a society is. Now, again, that's not the only measure, but how productive a society is on average per person. Again, there's some flaws with this, but the key is if we miss out on that and we just look in terms of GDP, oftentimes I will hear people say, China is catching up with the United States. And they, by the way, say that as though it's a terrible thing that China is catching up with the United States. Now, personally, I don't think it's a terrible thing. I think it would be wonderful if Chinese GDP caught up with the United States. Specialization is limited by the extent of the market. Having a lot of very wealthy people around the world would almost certainly lead to some pretty cool products that I would get to participate in. But even on a non-selfish level, it would definitely be a massive improvement in the quality of life around the world. You know, if we could get this, if we could even share that to Indian GDP, this would be phenomenal. However, it's sad but true that we are a long ways from China or India catching up with American GDP per capita. We may not be that far from them catching up in terms of GDP, but we are a long ways away from them catching up in terms of GDP per capita. So hopefully this illustrates the reason why we want to talk in terms of GDP per capita typically. At least for me as somebody who wants to understand well-being around the world and those two major questions of macroeconomics, differential prosperity across time and space, what certainly matters rather than GDP would be GDP per capita. Incidentally, if you think back to the last chapter when I was showing growth across time, going back to 10,000 BCE, one of the reasons why that was relatively flat was typically once people got wealthier, one of the things they did was have kids. And they were able to feed those kids, and more of those kids survived. And so GDP per capita ended up being roughly constant. Okay. So let's move on here. Hopefully you understand the difference between GDP as a whole and GDP per capita. Hopefully you understand what GDP is. Now, if we look at GDP per capita growth here across the 50 years from 1953 to 2003, basically the only country that managed to hit that level of growth was, well, it looks like maybe Thailand down there and China, maybe the UAE. I'm not entirely sure. There's a few other countries that managed to maintain somewhere between 2 and 4%. Now remember, that doesn't seem like much, but across those 50 years, if you could maintain 4% growth, that would be what, 17 and a half years to double. That would be close to 4 doublings, which would be a massive improvement in that 50 years. Only at 2%, you would probably get 1.5 doublings roughly, but still, that's pretty solid. Now you look at the countries that are a little bit pinkish there, 0 to 2%. That's closer to the historical norm, although even there, that's probably a miracle. And then you get to 0%. Now you'll notice this tan part, some countries that are tan, and you might say, where the heck is that on the chart? Now, if you think back to history, some of you might have some idea as to what is going on there. Most of that is the former USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And you might say, well, why are they excluded from the data? It's a good question. That actually might make for a good homework question. Why is the Soviet Union excluded from figure 6.4 here? I'll email that out as a homework question. See what you guys can come up with. Okay, so let's look at, so this here, maybe we can triangulate, maybe we could zoom in or rather zoom out and compare this with my other nice measure of well-being. Here's the world at night. And again, the world at night, I showed that initially, and the reason I did that was because that tells us something about well-being. It obviously is going to miss some things like population density. It's going to miss some other things. But does this track fairly well? I think it does. I think it does a pretty good job, again, with some exceptions, like Australia, of tracking well-being here. Again, mainly trying to emphasize here that we would want to triangulate. Okay. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. Something many of you may well be asking right now in the run-up to COVID here as we prepare for probably an Italian level outbreak, is what the heck is a recession or a depression? Now, a recession, we know what a recession is. A depression, we're not actually really sure. Turns out a depression is a term of art rather than a term of science. A depression is a very severe recession. So, a recession, there are a couple different definitions. This is the book definition, which is a recession is a significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy lasting more than a few months, normally visible in real GDP, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. Wow, that's a mouthful. Well, let's see if we again can take this to pieces here. So, it's a significant decline. Now, that on its own sparks some questions. Sometimes it depends on who you talk to. Some people talk about a recession being anytime you have 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction or negative economic growth. But the key here is that it's a significant decline. Not just we're staying steady, not just that we have slower growth rates, but we actually have a decline or negative growth. Now, the first thing I've highlighted here is that it needs to be spread across the economy. In other words, not located in a specific industry, not located in a specific geographic location. The idea would be that it's not, for example, right? I mean, you could talk about a recession in eastern Montana as a result of falling oil prices, or in the Bakken as a result of falling oil prices. And that would make sense. It might be a North Dakota recession, but it would not be an American recession. It would be an industry declined in an area. Now, in areas like North Dakota, particularly western North Dakota, where a large portion of economic activity is in the oil industry and fracking and shale, that could cause a recession. But the United States economy as a whole is diversified enough and varied enough that it will almost certainly not cause a recession. Now, if you think about COVID here, that's going to be pretty widespread. It's going to be pretty widespread geographically. It's going to be pretty widespread across a bunch of industries. There's going to be some industries that are going to do well, whether it's ventilators or masks or gowns and toilet paper, right? Some of those sectors are going to do very well. However, generally speaking, I suspect we are in for a significant decline in economic activity that more than outstrips the increase in those industries and those geographic locations. So spread across the economy. Lasting more than a few months, as I mentioned, so it's not just a one-time blip. Again, we may not be in for a recession, if you think about it. If all Americans were to hunker down for 2 weeks, we were to close the borders, and we then, at the end of 2 weeks, were able to figure out who was sick and who wasn't, and the people who were sick go into care, and everybody else can go about their life. 2 weeks later, things would pretty well pick back up. Now, on the other hand, if this ends up lingering and people infect each other, and we can't actually get a handle on this because people won't stay home and won't socially distance, then this may go on for 6 to 9 months, at which point we may have a pretty serious 6 to 9 month recession. Now, visible in real GDP. We'll mention here this is to distinguish real GDP from nominal GDP. In other words, we are adjusting for the purchasing power of the dollar. We will again come back to that when we get to the chapter on inflation. For now, just say that this is really, we're looking at GDP. So one area that this should be visible in is in GDP. But that's not all. Should also be visible in income, people's take-home income. Also visible in employment. Also visible in industrial production and wholesale retail sales. So what's going on with these last few? Really, these are an acknowledgement that we need to be triangulating across the economy, rather than just looking at GDP. If we just look at GDP, it may well be the case that we don't have a recession. If we just look at GDP, we may not have a recession when in fact there is one. On the other hand, if we look at other things, we might not see a recession when it's there. The key at this point would be that we need to triangulate across a number of places and a number of ways to look at this to get a sense of this decline in activity. Another thing to note, and then that'll probably be it for today, is that updates to this data can occur years after the first estimates are released. So there's this kind of puzzle with GDP and even a lot of government statistics, same thing with unemployment figures, is that the further back in time we go, the more confident we are that we have the correct value. Up to a point, obviously. We get to a certain point and it's a little hard to compare things across time, and you have to engage in some fairly heavy work like what the two people Madison and DeLong, the data that I showed going back to at least 0 BCE. But generally speaking, the further back we go, at least up to maybe a decade ago, the more confident we are in the results. Basically, you'll see things about quarterly GDP. In other words, I mentioned that earlier. So we are coming up here we'll be able to talk about what happened in the first quarter of 2020 in terms of GDP. That actually is going to be based on something like maybe 10% of the economy reporting in, based on some payroll figures, some corporate tax figures. It's likely to change quite a bit. And even if we get to January or February of 2021, we're going to have some estimate of GDP in the year 2020, but that will likely be subject to revisions for a long period to come. So we have this trade-off between accuracy. The further back we go, the more accurate our GDP predictions are. But the further back we go, the less useful GDP is as an indicator of what's going on, or for policy debates, or for planning. One thing, as an illustration of this, I think it wasn't until 2017, the annual meetings of the American Economics Association in 2017 or 2018, that we as a discipline established the date at which we agreed the financial crisis started, the last financial crisis. And again, I wasn't at that session. I don't exactly remember what it was, but I remember the notification that a bunch of economists had decided finally I think it was about 9 or 10 years later, because I can't remember, I think it was 2008. I don't exactly remember when in 2008, but that was when the financial crisis had started. So it's something to be aware of. More recent figures are relevant for policy making, but are less accurate, whereas ones that are older or further back in time are more accurate, but oftentimes less practically useful.